The crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across the marble floor of the Montgomery Tower ballroom, where Manhattan's elite had gathered to celebrate the opening of another monument to wealth and power. The evening had been proceeding with the predictable rhythm of champagne toasts and polite conversation when the sharp crash of shattering crystal sliced through the air like a blade. Every conversation stopped. Every head turned. There, kneeling among the glittering fragments of what had once been an expensive serving tray, was Maya Washington, a 35-year-old woman whose graceful movements seemed oddly at odds with her humble cleaning uniform. She had been working contract events for Sterling Holdings for only 3 weeks, moving through the crowd invisibly as she ensured everything remained perfect for the privileged guests. "Well, well, well," boomed a voice that commanded attention through sheer arrogance rather than respect. Charles Sterling III, the 62-year-old patriarch of the Sterling Empire, approached with the swagger of a man who had never been told no. His face was flushed with expensive whiskey and the intoxication of power. "If you can dance this waltz," he declared, pointing his champagne flute at Maya like a weapon, "I'll marry my son to you." The proclamation hit the room like a thunderclap. 200 of Manhattan's most influential people fell into stunned silence, then erupted into cruel laughter that echoed off the marble walls like the sound of breaking glass. Maya remained kneeling, her hands moving methodically to collect the sharp fragments, but her dark eyes held something that none of the laughing guests could interpret. It wasn't shame or fear. It was the calm stillness of deep water, hiding currents that ran far deeper than anyone in that room could imagine. "Dad, that's enough," whispered David Sterling, Charles's 28-year-old son, his voice tight with embarrassment. The young man had been watching the scene unfold with growing discomfort, recognizing the cruelty in his father's entertainment. But Charles was just getting started, basking in the attention of his audience. "No, let me finish," he continued, moving to the center of the room as if addressing a courtroom. "This woman clearly lacks the coordination to perform simple cleaning tasks. Perhaps we should test whether she possesses even the most basic sense of rhythm." The guests' laughter grew louder, feeding off each other's cruelty like wolves in a pack. Maya continued gathering the crystal shards, her movements deliberate and controlled, as if she were performing a sacred ritual rather than cleaning up an accident. The event coordinator, a nervous man in an ill-fitting tuxedo, stepped forward, tentatively. "Mr. Sterling, perhaps we should—" "Perhaps nothing." Charles cut him off with a theatrical wave. "Play a waltz. If she can dance better than my wife, I'll marry my son to her on the spot. Just imagine, the heir to the Sterling fortune wed to the cleaning lady." The suggestion sent fresh waves of laughter rippling through the crowd. Some of the women covered their mouths in mock horror, their eyes gleaming with the excitement of witnessing someone else's humiliation. The men nodded approvingly, as if witnessing a perfectly acceptable display of social dominance. Maya finally rose to her feet, brushing imaginary dust from her apron with movements that somehow managed to be both humble and dignified. She looked directly at Charles Sterling, and for a moment that stretched like eternity, the room held its collective breath. "I accept," she said, her voice cutting through the air with the clarity of a silver bell. The laughter died as if someone had thrown a switch. Even the string quartet in the corner faltered, their instruments going silent as they tried to process what they had just heard. Charles blinked several times, his whiskey-addled brain struggling to comprehend the unexpected response. "What did you say?" "I said I accept your challenge," Maya repeated, this time with a smile that sent an inexplicable chill down the spines of several guests. "But when I dance better than your wife, and I will, you'll honor your word, even if it was spoken in jest." The crowd erupted again, but this time the laughter carried an edge of uncertainty. They had expected to witness a humiliation, not whatever this was becoming. What none of them knew was that the woman they were mocking had once been known by a different name, Maya Beaumont, principal dancer of the American National Ballet. For 7 glorious years, she had graced the world's most prestigious stages, earning standing ovations and critical acclaim that compared her to the greatest ballerinas in history. That life had ended 15 years ago in a single, devastating night. A benefit performance for political dignitaries, followed by a car accident that left her in a coma for 3 months. When she finally awakened, the doctors delivered their verdict with clinical detachment. Her legs would never be the same. A professional day. Dance was impossible. She would be fortunate to walk normally again. The media had declared her career over, speculating about the tragic end of a rising star. Maya had believed them. For years, she had believed them. Charles's wife, Elizabeth, Sterling glided forward with the predatory grace of a woman accustomed to being the apex predator in any social situation. At 50, she was still beautiful in the way that money could maintain, her figure sculpted by expensive personal trainers, and her confidence built on a foundation of inherited superiority. Darling, surely I don't need to lower myself to compete with this, she said, gesturing dismissively toward Maya. Don't be modest, Elizabeth, Charles replied, clearly relishing every moment. You won the Metropolitan Club's ballroom dancing trophy last year. That should be more than sufficient for this little demonstration. Maya watched in silence, but her mind traveled back through the years to when she had been Maya Beaumont, when entire audiences would rise to their feet in thunderous ovation. She remembered the intoxicating feeling of flight, of becoming pure movement and music, of touching something divine through the language of dance. David, Charles called to his son, get your phone out. I want this recorded for posterity. The night a cleaning woman tried to pass herself off as a dancer at my event. David hesitated, his face pale with discomfort. Dad, this has gone far enough. She was just doing her job. The girl accepted the challenge. Charles cut him off sarcastically. And now she's going to entertain us. Unless you'd prefer I tell your fiancé about that embarrassing incident last week at the club. David's face went white. Maya realized that blackmail was involved, another demonstration of the toxic control Charles wielded over everyone in his orbit. Start the music, Charles ordered the DJ. And take bets, everyone. $500 for those wise enough to wager on my wife. $1,000 for anyone foolish enough to back our guest performer. The cruel laughter returned, accompanied now by the actual exchange of money as guests treated the situation like a sporting event. Several pulled out their phones to record what they expected to be a spectacular humiliation. Elizabeth positioned herself in the center of the dance floor, executing a few theatrical stretches to display her supposed expertise. Her movements were competent but mechanical, the product of expensive lessons at exclusive clubs rather than any genuine artistry. You know what? Charles said, approaching Maya with a malicious smile. When you lose, and you will lose, I want you to get on your knees and apologize to everyone here for wasting their time. And then, obviously, you're fired. It was at that moment that something fundamental shifted in Maya's eyes. The same determination that had once driven her to perfect impossible combinations on the world's greatest stages. The same strength that had carried her through months of agonizing physical therapy just to walk again. The same dignity that had sustained her through 15 years of rebuilding her life from nothing. Mr. Sterling, she said, with a calmness that made several guests unexpectedly uncomfortable. When I win, and I will win, I expect you to honor your word about the marriage. But I also want something else. Charles raised an eyebrow, amused by what he perceived as her audacity. Oh, she wants to make demands now. Very well. Entertain me. What else do you want besides marrying my son? I want you to admit in front of all these guests that you judged a woman wrongly based on the color of her skin and the nature of her work. And I want a public apology. The room tensed. The laughter died away as guests recognized that the evening had taken a more serious turn than they had anticipated. Charles laughed loudly, but there was less confidence in it now. "You've got nerve, I'll give you that." "All right, I accept your terms, but when you make a fool of yourself, you'll leave here with neither job nor dignity intact." What Charles Sterling III didn't realize was that he was about to face not just a cleaning woman with a mysterious past, but someone who had lost everything once and knew exactly how precious and powerful dignity could be. From across the room, Marcus Thompson, the building's 60-year-old head of security, watched the proceedings with growing recognition. He had worked security at cultural venues throughout the city for decades, and something about Maya's bearing was triggering memories he couldn't quite place. As Elizabeth warmed up with basic ballroom moves, Maya stood perfectly still in the corner of the dance floor. But her mind was working with the precision of a master craftsman, calculating angles and possibilities, remembering muscle memory that had been buried but never truly lost. "Look at her," one guest whispered to her companion. "She's probably never set foot on a proper dance floor in her life." "What unnecessary cruelty," another murmured, though not loudly enough for Charles to hear. Charles continued circling the room like a satisfied predator, collecting wages and escalating the humiliation. 500 says she can't make it through a single song without falling," he announced, raising his champagne glass. 1,000 for anyone who thinks she'll run out mid-performance. More laughter echoed through the hall, but Maya noticed something Charles had missed. His son David wasn't laughing. The young man stood near the wall, shifting uncomfortably and avoiding eye contact with the crowd. It was then that she recognized something familiar about David's face. 3 weeks ago, when she had started working Sterling Holdings events, she had noticed a young executive who always treated the contract workers with respect, bringing them water, saying please and thank you, asking about their families. It was him. "Miss," a low voice said beside her. Maya turned to see Marcus approaching discreetly, pretending to check something on his radio. "I'm Marcus Thompson, head of security. I've worked here 20 years. He moved closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "I saw you dance before. 15 years ago at Lincoln Center. Maya Beaumont, principal soloist. I was working security there too." Maya's heart raced. After all these years of anonymity, of working invisible jobs to survive, someone had recognized her. "I thought you had died in the accident," Marcus continued, his eyes revealing a mixture of shock and admiration. "The newspapers said you'd never dance again." "The newspapers said many things," Maya replied, keeping her voice steady. "Not all of them were true." Marcus nodded slowly. "What they're doing." "To you now," he glanced toward Charles, who was still holding court, "is worse than what happened then." At that moment, Maya made a decision she had been avoiding for 15 years. Not just about dancing, but about who she truly was and what she was willing to reveal to the world. "Marcus," she said, "I need you to record everything that happens after I dance, especially their reactions." He looked puzzled but nodded. "Of course, but why?" Maya smiled for the first time that evening. "Because some people need to be reminded that underestimating someone based on appearances can be the most expensive mistake they'll ever make." Charles, meanwhile, had decided to escalate his cruel entertainment. "You know what?" he shouted to the room. "Let's make this even more interesting. If she can finish the entire song without falling or stopping, I'll give her $1,000. But when she fails, and she will fail, I want her to clean this entire ballroom on her knees, in front of all of us." The crowd's reaction was mixed. More laughter from some, but uncomfortable murmurs from others, who were beginning to realize the situation had crossed ethical lines. "Dad," David tried once more, "this has gone too far." "Shut up, David," Charles snapped. "You're too soft. This is exactly why you need to learn how the real world works. There's a natural hierarchy, and people like her," he pointed at Maya, "need to understand their place in it." It was at that moment that Maya began to move, not to position herself for dancing, but to stretch. The movements were subtle, almost imperceptible to most observers, but Marcus recognized them immediately. They were the preparatory exercises Maya Beaumont had performed before every performance at Lincoln Center. "My God," Marcus whispered to himself. "She's really going to do this." Elizabeth, realizing that attention was shifting toward Maya, decided to begin her presentation. "Start the music," she commanded. "Let's end this charade." The DJ, clearly uncomfortable with the entire situation, selected a classical waltz. Elizabeth began dancing alone, executing competent but predictable ballroom moves. Her technique was adequate for social dancing, but obviously amateur by professional standards. Still, she received polite applause from the audience, who saw in her everything they considered proper and appropriate. "Excellent, darling," Charles applauded dramatically. "Now it's time for our featured performer." Maya walked slowly to the center of the dance floor. Each step was measured, controlled, radiating a dignity that began to make several guests genuinely uncomfortable. This was not how a defeated person was supposed to behave. "What music would you like?" the DJ asked, more from politeness than genuine consideration. "The same piece," Maya replied simply. "But from the beginning." Charles laughed. "Oh, she wants a fresh start. How charming. Play the song again. Let's see how long she lasts before giving up." What none of them knew was that Maya had chosen that waltz strategically. It was a piece she had performed hundreds of times during her career, music that flowed through her muscle memory like a river finding its natural course. More importantly, it was one of the last performances she had given before the accident. A night when she had received a 5-minute standing ovation at Lincoln Center in what critics had called transcendent, and one of the most emotionally devastating performances in American dance history. As she waited for the music to begin, Maya closed her eyes and allowed her memories to carry her back to that night 15 years ago. She remembered the sensation of flight, the profound connection with each musical phrase, the absolute certainty that she had been born for this. The doctors had said she would never dance again. The media had declared her career finished. For years, she had believed them. But slowly, painfully, she had begun to rebuild not only her damaged muscles, but her relationship with movement itself. She had never returned to the stage, never attempted to resume her career, but she had never stopped dancing, alone, in secret, during the most difficult moments of her new life. The music began, and with it, something extraordinary was about to unfold in that hall full of prejudice and arrogance. Maya's hands positioned themselves with a precision that made several musicians in the quartet frown, instinctively recognizing that they were about to witness something far beyond amateur entertainment. The opening bars of the waltz filled the air, and Maya began to move. It was not the hesitant, awkward steps everyone expected. Instead, she seemed to rise with a grace that transformed the very atmosphere of the room, as if gravity had loosened its hold on her alone. Her initial movements were understated, allowing the audience to maintain their low expectations. But, as the music gained momentum, something magical began to happen. Each step became more fluid, each turn more precise, each gesture charged with an emotional depth that began to mesmerize everyone present. Charles Sterling stopped laughing. Elizabeth stopped smiling. The entire room began to understand that they were not watching a cleaning woman attempt to dance. They were witnessing an artist reclaiming her rightful place in the world. "My God," someone in the audience whispered. She's extraordinary." Maya executed a series of pirouettes that would challenge any professional ballerina, followed by a grand jeté that lifted her into the air with seemingly impossible lightness. These were not ballroom dance moves. This was classical ballet of the highest caliber, masterfully adapted to the waltz's 3/4 rhythm. Marcus, honoring his promise, had discreetly positioned his phone to capture not only the performance, but the audience's reactions, especially Charles Sterling's face, which had transformed from smug superiority to confusion, then to something approaching terror. "This is impossible," Charles whispered, his voice cracking. "Who is this woman?" When Maya performed the climactic sequence of her old Lincoln Center performance, a unique combination of movements that had been her signature, a fusion of classical techniques she had developed herself, recognition began to dawn on some of the more culturally aware guests. "Wait," said a woman in the audience, a prominent arts patron who attended every major cultural event in the city. "I know those movements. I've seen that sequence before, but where?" David Sterling stood transfixed, his phone capturing every second of the performance. Unlike his father, he recognized genius when he encountered it, regardless of the circumstances in which it appeared. As the music reached its crescendo, Maya performed a series of fouettes, continuous turns on one leg that left the entire audience breathless. These were movements that required not only flawless technique, but years of training and extraordinary physical strength. The music came to its conclusion, and Maya finished in a pose that was simultaneously powerful and vulnerable, arms extended, head held high with absolute dignity, breathing controlled despite the intensity of what she had just accomplished. The silence that followed seemed to last forever. It was the kind of silence that occurs when an audience witnesses something that transcends their wildest expectations, something that touches the divine. Then slowly, one person began to applaud, then another. Within seconds, the entire hall was on its feet, clapping with an intensity that made the crystal chandelier tremble. "Bravo!" someone shouted. "Magnificent!" echoed another. Charles Sterling stood pale as death, finally comprehending that he had just been utterly humiliated by someone he had considered beneath his notice. Worse, he had orchestrated his own downfall in front of Manhattan's elite, who now looked at him with a mixture of disapproval and embarrassment. Marcus approached Maya, still recording. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced loudly enough for everyone to hear, "allow me to introduce Maya Beaumont, former principal soloist of the American National Ballet." The name exploded through the hall like a bomb. Several people gasped audibly, others exclaimed in shock. Maya Beaumont was a legend, a ballerina who had mysteriously vanished at the height of her career after a tragic accident. "Impossible," Elizabeth Sterling stammered. "Maya Beaumont is dead, or at least she never danced again after the accident." "Clearly," Maya said, breaking her silence with a slight smile, "the reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated." The crowd laughed appreciatively, but Charles Sterling found nothing amusing about the situation. The full magnitude of what had occurred was crashing down on him like an avalanche. He had publicly humiliated one of the greatest artists in American history, and it was all recorded. "Mr. Sterling," Marcus said, still holding his phone high, "you stated that if she danced better than your wife, you would arrange a marriage with your son. I believe this entire audience can attest that your conditions have been more than fulfilled." Jonathan, realizing the trajectory of events, approached Maya. "Miss Beaumont," he said respectfully, "I want to publicly apologize for my father's behavior. It was inexcusable." "David, shut up!" Charles exploded, his carefully maintained facade finally cracking completely. "You will not apologize to anyone, especially not to her." It was at that moment that Maya revealed the full scope of her strategy. "Mr. Sterling," she said with perfect calm, "I believe we have a marriage proposal to discuss. After all, a man of your standing surely honors his word, doesn't he?" The audience fell silent again, understanding they were witnessing something far more significant than a simple display of talent. "You must be insane if you think I'll honor a drunken joke," Charles snarled, his arrogance returning in the form of desperation. "But it wasn't a joke," Maya replied, her smile never wavering. "Marcus, would you mind playing back Mr. Sterling's statements from this evening?" Marcus held his phone high enough for everyone to hear as he played the crystal-clear recording of Charles making the bet, elaborating the conditions, escalating the humiliations, and publicly declaring he would marry his son to her if she won the challenge. "And here he is, confirming the terms, even after I specified he would need to honor his word," the recording continued. the audience murmured, some laughing nervously, others clearly embarrassed by the situation Charles had created for himself. "This is blackmail," Charles shouted, completely losing his composure. "No," Maya corrected gently. "This is accountability. You made a public wager with clear terms in front of 200 witnesses. Now you must decide whether you are a man of your word, or whether your reputation is worth less than your prejudices." David stepped closer to Maya. "Miss Beaumont," he said, "if you'll permit me, I would like to honor my father's commitment. Not because I'm compelled to, but because any man would be privileged to marry someone of your talent and dignity." The audience murmured in surprise at the unexpected romantic development. Charles was now visibly trembling with rage. "David, if you do this, you're cut off from the company, the family, everything." "Then so be it," David replied, extending his hand toward Maya. "Some things matter more than money, Dad, like having integrity." Maya looked at the offered hand, then at the audience, then at Charles Sterling, who appeared to be having what looked like a public nervous breakdown. "Mr. Sterling," she said, 15 years ago, people like you decided I had no value after I became imperfect. Tonight, you attempted to humiliate me based on the color of my skin and the work I do to survive. But do you know what I've learned? True nobility doesn't come from inheritance or bank accounts. It comes from how we treat other human beings when we think no one is watching." She turned to David. "Your son seems to have learned that lesson despite your worst efforts. As for your proposal," she smiled, "I'll accept dinner with him. But marriage? Well, that's something two people decide together, based on love and respect, not humiliating wagers." The audience erupted in applause once more, but this time it wasn't just for the dancing. It was approval for the dignity and wisdom Maya had demonstrated throughout the ordeal. Charles Sterling, realizing he had lost not only the bet but the respect of everyone present, including his own son, muttered something about calling his lawyers and stormed out of the hall, followed by Elizabeth, who was clearly mortified by the entire situation. Marcus stopped recording and approached. "Maya, this is going to be very interesting when it reaches social media," he said with a knowing smile. As Manhattan's elite continued processing what they had witnessed, a masterclass in prejudice, humility, and the difference between social class and true class, one question lingered in the air. How would Charles Sterling, a man who had built his empire on reputation, handle the fact that his arrogance and bigotry had been exposed in the most public and humiliating way possible, and that this exposure was about to spread far beyond the walls of that ballroom? The video Marcus recorded spread across social media platforms like wildfire. Within 24 hours, billionaire humiliates legendary ballerina had become a global trending topic, accumulating millions of views and tens of thousands of outraged comments from around the world. Charles Sterling III awakened the following saw. Mourning to discover that Sterling Holdings had lost 4 major contracts worth over $5 million overnight. His business partners were demanding an emergency board meeting, and his wife Elizabeth had locked herself in their bedroom, refusing to face the public humiliation. "Dad," David said when he found his father in his office, surrounded by newspapers, bearing devastating headlines. "The board has voted. You have 1 hour to resign, or you'll be removed by force." Charles looked at his son, seeing for the first time not submission, but unwavering determination. "You orchestrated this," he whispered. "You betrayed me." "No," David replied calmly. "You betrayed yourself the moment you decided your arrogance was more valuable than your humanity." Meanwhile, Maya was being inundated with offers. 3 international ballet companies wanted her to choreograph special performances. Lincoln Center had called with an offer for a solo retrospective. Hollywood producers were interested in turning her story into a film. But the offer that moved her most came from an unexpected source: the children at the community center where she had been teaching dance classes before taking the cleaning job. They had pooled their allowances, $28 total, to offer her a scholarship to return to teaching them. "I'll take it," Maya said through tears, "but on one Condition, let's turn this into something much bigger. 8 months later, the Maya Beaumont Center for the Arts opened in the heart of Manhattan, funded by donations that had poured in from around the world after her story went viral. David Sterling, now running a completely transformed version of the family business focused on social responsibility and ethical practices, was the largest single donor. Charles Sterling, meanwhile, had lost everything. His company, his reputation, his family. Elizabeth had filed for divorce and moved to France. He was last seen working as a mid-level consultant at a small firm, a shadow of the arrogant man who had once believed that wealth gave him the right to humiliate other human beings. "You know what impresses me most about this story?" Marcus said during the center's grand opening, watching Maya teach a class of diverse, beaming children. It wasn't just a victory over prejudice. It was a lesson in how true nobility responds to cruelty. Maya, now recognized once again as one of the greatest artists of her generation, smiled as she watched her students perform their first ballet combinations. Sometimes, she reflected, we have to lose everything to discover who we really are. And sometimes people have to lose everything to learn who they should never have tried to be. David approached, carrying flowers from the garden he had personally planted around the center. "Ready for dinner?" he asked, offering his arm to Maya. "Ready," she replied, accepting not only his arm, but the new life she had built from the ashes of her old one. Maya's true revenge hadn't been destroying Charles Sterling. It had been creating something so beautiful and inspiring that his cruelty seemed insignificant by comparison. She had proven that when we face prejudice with dignity and respond to hatred with excellence, we don't just win. We transform the world around us. The lesson resonated far beyond that Manhattan ballroom. True power doesn't come from the ability to humiliate others, but from the strength to rise above humiliation with grace. And sometimes, the person you underestimate based on appearances might just be extraordinary enough to change your life forever, whether you want them to or not.